Before we dive into tonight's exploration, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, and if you genuinely appreciate the content I create here, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always find it incredible to see how far our community reaches. Now get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights, turn on a fan for some ambient noise, and let's journey back together to a civilization that still captivates us thousands of years later. Ancient Egypt. A world of towering monuments, divine rulers, and a society that functioned under rules we can barely comprehend today. These weren't just kings. These were living gods, men who wielded absolute power with zero accountability, zero oversight, and zero consequences. What happens when you give someone unlimited authority and tell them they're divine? What happens when nobody can say no? What happens when the entire structure of civilization is designed to serve one person's desires? Tonight, we're talking about the pharaohs who didn't just rule Egypt. They redefined boundaries, broke taboos, and lived in ways that would shock even the most liberal modern sensibilities. Some overshared their personal lives in ways that made their subjects deeply uncomfortable. Others collected wives and children like they were building an empire within an empire. Some vanished from history because what they did was too disturbing to record. And others? Others simply stayed in power so long that decay became inevitable. This isn't about demonizing ancient rulers. This is about understanding what absolute power actually looks like when it's allowed to run unchecked for decades, sometimes centuries. These stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings carved in stone, preserved in sand, and whispered through millennia. Let's start with a pharaoh who made everyone profoundly uncomfortable, not through violence, but through something far more unsettling: emotional transparency. Akhenaten didn't just rule Egypt. He made Egypt watch his personal life unfold in real time, carved into stone for eternity. If ancient Egypt had social media, Akhenaten would have been that person posting intimate family moments that make everyone scroll faster while simultaneously unable to look away. Before Akhenaten, pharaohs were untouchable. They were distant figures, carved in perfect stillness, staring into eternity with expressions that revealed nothing. They didn't smile. They didn't show affection. They definitely didn't cuddle their wives in public or kiss their children where anyone could see. Family life happened behind closed doors, in private quarters, far from public monuments and temple walls. That was the unspoken rule. Power was performed through distance, through mystery, through divine separation from ordinary human emotion. Akhenaten looked at all of that and said absolutely not. He commissioned massive reliefs showing himself lounging with his wife Nefertiti, touching her face, holding hands, sitting knee to knee, kissing their daughters, acting like a man who genuinely believed that emotional intimacy was a spectator sport. These weren't small private carvings hidden in some back chamber. These were enormous public monuments. Stone billboards of domestic affection placed where everyone had to see them. Now, historians can dress this up with academic language, divine breath symbolism, religious metaphors, Aten theology, spiritual unity, all perfectly valid scholarly interpretations. But here's the thing. Ancient Egyptians didn't read footnotes. They saw their god-king acting like someone's dad at a weekend barbecue and thought, this is deeply weird. And then, there was his appearance. Akhenaten was depicted with features that looked nothing like the standard pharaoh template. Elongated limbs, wide hips, soft curves, narrow shoulders, an almost androgynous body shape so different from the muscular warrior kings before him that it seemed like Egypt had accidentally hired a completely different species of ruler. Earlier pharaohs looked like they could bench press a pyramid. Akhenaten looked like a philosophical thought experiment. Some scholars say it was symbolic. Some say medical. Some say religious. But what ancient Egyptians knew was simple. This man does not look like what we expect a god to look like. And when you change religion, art, gender presentation, and public displays of affection all at the same time, people don't calmly adjust. They panic quietly. To modern eyes, Akhenaten almost looks progressive. Open affection, emotional vulnerability, family focus, revolutionary stuff. But to his own society, he felt threatening. Pharaohs weren't supposed to be relatable. They weren't supposed to make you wonder what was happening behind palace doors. They weren't supposed to make you feel things when you looked at temple walls. Akhenaten didn't just change Egypt's religion. He changed boundaries. And Egypt absolutely hated the update. His reforms were erased after his death. His name was removed from king lists. His capital city was abandoned. It's like Egypt collectively decided to pretend he never existed. When a society tries that hard to forget you, it's usually because you made them profoundly uncomfortable. If Akhenaten made Egypt uncomfortable by breaking boundaries, our next pharaoh made Egypt exhausted by never, ever stopping. Ramesses II did everything in bulk. Temples, statues, inscriptions, military campaigns, and most notably children, especially children. This man approached reproduction with the enthusiasm of someone who believed fertility was a divine commandment and moderation was a personal insult. Ramesses ruled for 66 years. Most Egyptians alive during his reign only ever knew one pharaoh. They were born under Ramesses. They grew up under Ramesses. They had children under Ramesses. They grew old under Ramesses. And when they finally died, Ramesses was still there. That kind of prolonged rule creates a dangerous psychological dynamic. When one person controls everything for that long, systems start to warp around them. But Ramesses didn't just rule. He reproduced with industrial efficiency. Conservative estimates put his offspring at over 100 children. Let that number actually sink in for a moment. That's not a family. That's a population. Entire sections of the palace were dedicated just to housing his children. Historians still argue about the exact count because at some point people stopped keeping careful records out of sheer exhaustion. Royal marriages in Egypt were political tools. We understand that. But Ramesses treated marriage like a competitive hobby. He married Egyptian noblewomen, foreign princesses for diplomatic alliances, secondary wives, concubines. He stacked marriages and heirs with the same energy modern people collect streaming service subscriptions. Did he need all of them? Absolutely not. Did he want all of them? Without question. What makes Ramesses particularly fascinating is that he wanted everyone to know about it. His temple inscriptions bragged about his virility, the way other kings bragged about defeating enemies in battle. He wasn't content being remembered as a great military leader or successful diplomat. He wanted future generations to understand that he was also extremely productive in private. Temple reliefs show him surrounded by wives and children, presented as concrete proof of divine favor. In Ramesses' worldview, producing endless heirs wasn't self-indulgence. It was cosmic balance. The gods approved. Look at all these children. Checkmate. And Egypt largely accepted it. Ramesses won wars. He stabilized borders. He built monuments that still dominate Egypt's landscape today. When a ruler delivers peace and prosperity, society becomes remarkably tolerant of excess. If anything, his fertility was seen as reassuring. A stable dynasty needs heirs. Ramesses had backups for his backups for his backups. But from our perspective, it's impossible not to notice how unchecked power manifests. Ramesses never faced limits. Nobody told him enough. Nobody suggested rest. Nobody dared imply that maybe, possibly, he could slow down. When you're worshipped as a living God, self-control becomes entirely optional. Ramesses didn't scandalize Egypt with secrecy or shame. He overwhelmed it with sheer volume. And history teaches us one lesson very clearly. When power lasts long enough without interruption, excess stops feeling excessive. It starts feeling normal, expected, even virtuous. Now we come to a pharaoh who didn't scandalize Egypt by being flashy or excessive. He scandalized it by ruling for so absurdly long that everyone eventually got bored. And bored courts invent stories. Lots of stories. The kind that survive for thousands of years because nobody's left alive to deny them. Pepi II ascended the throne as a small child and then simply never left. He ruled for decades upon decades. Long enough to outlive rivals, advisors, heirs, and probably several generations of palace gossip. When a king stays in power that long, two things inevitably happen. First, institutions begin to decay. Second, rumors get absolutely wild. Later Egyptian texts, written generations after Pepi's death, claimed that the aging pharaoh had developed a rather specific habit. He allegedly snuck out of the palace at night, disguised, to visit the wife of one of his trusted generals. Not publicly, not ceremonially, secretly, like a man who understood very well that even gods aren't immune to scandal if enough people notice. Was it true? We have no idea. Contemporary records are completely silent, which is suspicious in itself. Egyptian scribes were extremely good at recording victories and extremely bad at recording embarrassments. But the fact that the rumors survived tells us something important. People found it believable. And believability matters more than truth when it comes to reputation. Pepi ruled during the slow, grinding collapse of the Old Kingdom. Central authority weakened gradually. Regional officials grew increasingly independent. The once absolute divine image of the pharaoh began to crack like old paint. When the state falters, respect erodes. And when respect erodes, whispers grow louder. By the time later writers describe Pepi's alleged nocturnal adventures, the story served a clear purpose. It explained decline. It personalized decay. Instead of complicated economic problems or administrative failures, you had a simple narrative. An aging ruler slipping through streets at night, indulging private desires, while the kingdom quietly unraveled around him. It's not even the affair itself that matters here. It's the symbolism. Pepi became a cautionary tale. A reminder that when power lingers too long without renewal, discipline fades. When nobody can remove you, nobody can stop you. And when nobody can stop you, the rules start to feel like suggestions rather than boundaries. Pepi didn't scandalize Egypt in his youth. He became scandalous by outlasting accountability. By staying so long that the system designed to support him began to crumble. And history, as we've learned repeatedly, never forgives rulers who stay past their expiration date. Let's talk about Cleopatra. Not the Egyptian view of Cleopatra, but the Roman view. Because Cleopatra is a fascinating case study in how scandal isn't always about what you did. Sometimes it's entirely about who gets to write about you afterward. If ancient history had comment sections, Cleopatra would have been absolutely destroyed by Roman authors with severe confidence issues and even more severe biases. To be completely clear, Cleopatra ruled Egypt intelligently. She spoke multiple languages. She stabilized a collapsing kingdom through shrewd diplomacy. She negotiated directly with the most powerful men in the Mediterranean world as an equal. Naturally, Roman historians looked at this and concluded that obviously she must have been dangerously seductive. Because heaven forbid a woman be competent without some kind of moral explanation attached. Most of what we think we know about Cleopatra's supposed excess comes from Roman writers who absolutely despised her. These were men living in a society deeply uncomfortable with women wielding political power independently. When Cleopatra aligned herself with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, Roman propaganda didn't describe it as strategic diplomacy. It described it as enchantment, corruption, magic, the ancient equivalent of saying he only lost because she distracted him. Cleopatra understood spectacle. She used luxury, symbolism, and calculated intimacy as political tools. Not because she was indulgent by nature, but because politics in the ancient world was theater. When she arrived rolled in a carpet or hosted elaborate banquets, she wasn't being excessive for personal pleasure. She was negotiating in a language Rome understood perfectly well when it benefited them. But once Rome won the civil wars, the narrative flipped completely. Suddenly Cleopatra wasn't a skilled ruler. She was a temptress. Her intelligence became manipulation. Her diplomatic alliances became proof of moral corruption. Her confidence became existential danger. Roman poets painted her as a decadent Eastern queen who weakened strong Roman men through luxury and pleasure. Which is an extremely convenient story when you want to blame a civil war on someone who isn't Roman. What makes Cleopatra's case especially ironic is that Roman elites were wildly indulgent themselves. Their banquets, affairs, and power games would make most pharaohs look restrained by comparison. But Rome didn't mind excess. It minded who controlled it. A Roman man enjoying luxury was sophisticated. A foreign woman doing the same was corruption. So Cleopatra became history's favorite villainous woman. Not because she actually broke significant taboos, but because she refused to submit quietly. Her real perversion, in Roman eyes, was independence. Her actual crime was competence without permission. Cleopatra didn't scandalize Egypt. She terrified Rome. And history, written by victors with axes to grind, turned that fear into scandal that lasted millennia. Now we come to a pharaoh often remembered as the polite, golden-faced boy king who didn't really have time to do anything scandalous before dying young. Which is technically true, but also deeply misleading. Because Tutankhamun didn't need to do anything perverted. He was born directly into it. Ancient Egyptian royalty believed their bloodline was divine. The gods married their siblings in mythology. Therefore, kings should do the same in reality. Simple divine logic. Questionable biological execution. This meant that incest wasn't a scandal in ancient Egypt. It was state policy. What modern society considers deeply disturbing, ancient Egypt framed as sacred tradition wrapped in ritual and gold leaf. Tutankhamun was the product of this system. Genetic evidence shows he was born from closely related parents, almost certainly siblings. To Egyptians at the time, this preserved divine purity. To modern observers, it explains his long list of medical problems and makes everyone quietly uncomfortable during museum visits. And the cycle didn't stop with his birth. Tutankhamun himself married a close family member, continuing the tradition without hesitation or debate. There was no palace meeting where someone suggested maybe, possibly, expanding the gene pool just a little. The system was bigger than any individual. You didn't opt out. You complied with what generations before you had established. What makes this especially unsettling is how completely normalized it was. This wasn't hidden in shadows. It wasn't whispered about in corners. It was carved into temple walls and blessed by priests. When the entire religious and political system declares something holy, it stops being taboo no matter how strange it looks centuries later. Of course, there were consequences. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple health issues. He struggled physically. He required medical support just to function normally. Ancient artists tried to hide this behind idealized imagery, but reality leaked through in subtle ways. Divine blood came with very human costs. To be fair, Tutankhamun himself didn't invent this tradition. He inherited it. He was a teenager following rules written long before his birth. Rules that valued symbolic purity over actual well-being. In that sense, he's less a villain and more a cautionary example of what happens when tradition becomes completely untouchable. Tutankhamun wasn't perverted in the indulgent sense. He was perverted by system design. When power declares something sacred, it doesn't matter how biologically harmful it is. It becomes normal, necessary, divine, and everyone pretends not to notice the consequences accumulating in royal tombs. If Tutankhamun shows us what happens when tradition runs on autopilot, Amenhotep III shows us what happens when everything is going too well for too long. His reign was one of peace, wealth, and international prestige, which, historically speaking, is exactly when rulers start confusing stability with personal entitlement. Amenhotep didn't conquer relentlessly like his predecessors. He didn't panic about enemies threatening borders. He inherited a strong, stable state and decided to enjoy it thoroughly. His Egypt was rich beyond measure, admired internationally, drowning in tribute gold. Foreign rulers sent him gifts, daughters, and flattering letters that basically said, "Please like us. We want to stay on your good side." And Amenhotep accepted all of it with the enthusiasm of a man who believed the universe was his personal reward program. His palace life became legendary. Banquets were frequent and elaborate. Festivals stretched for days. The court overflowed with musicians, dancers, entertainers, and foreign princesses sent as diplomatic packages. Officially, these marriages secured alliances and demonstrated Egypt's reach. Unofficially, Amenhotep collected wives the way people collect souvenirs. Proof he had been somewhere important. At some point, diplomacy clearly turned into indulgence. Amenhotep's harem grew massive. His inscriptions never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how favored he was by divine forces. If Akhenaten overshared emotionally, Amenhotep overshared materially. Everything was bigger, shinier, louder, and more expensive, including his personal life. What makes this particularly interesting is that nobody objected. Why would they? Egypt was peaceful. Trade flowed smoothly. Temples rose constantly. When a ruler delivers prosperity, society becomes incredibly flexible about what counts as excess. The phrase, "the king is indulging," quietly transforms into, "well, he earned it." But indulgence has side effects that accumulate slowly. Amenhotep grew increasingly detached from actual administration. He delegated more responsibility while focusing on pleasure and spectacle. By the end of his reign, he ruled more like a divine celebrity than an active governor. The court revolved around ritual, luxury, and appearance rather than discipline or restraint. This atmosphere shaped the next generation. Akhenaten didn't emerge from nowhere. He was raised in a world where excess was normal, where indulgence was framed as divine favor, and where limits were completely optional. Amenhotep didn't break Egypt, but he softened it. He turned power into comfort, and comfort into expectation. Amenhotep the third wasn't perverted in a scandalous way. He was perverted by success without consequence. And history is very clear on this point. When rulers stop worrying about survival, they start indulging themselves. And those indulgences, even when wrapped in gold and divine language, leave marks. Hatshepsut didn't scandalize Egypt by indulging too much. She scandalized Egypt simply by being there at all, which, historically speaking, is often more than enough. Ancient Egypt had queens. It had priestesses. It had powerful royal wives and women behind the scenes pulling strings. But the throne itself? That was supposed to be male. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally male. Kingship was wrapped in masculine symbolism, ritual language, and divine imagery so rigid that trying to bend it caused a collective cultural headache. So when Hatshepsut stepped forward and declared herself pharaoh, Egypt didn't know what to do with its collective face. She didn't rule quietly as a queen regent, guiding a young heir from the shadows. She ruled openly, publicly, confidently. She wore the crown. She wore the royal kilt. And yes, she wore the ceremonial false beard. Not because she wanted to confuse people, but because those were literally the job requirements. If kingship came with a beard, then fine. She wore the beard. To conservative elites, this wasn't just political disruption. It was cosmic discomfort. The pharaoh wasn't merely a ruler. The pharaoh was the bridge between gods and earth, between divine order and human chaos. If the bridge suddenly changed shape, people worried the universe itself might notice and respond poorly. And so rumors began. Not about her competence, because she was extremely competent, but about her body, her sexuality, her legitimacy, her right to exist in that space. When a woman breaks power structures, scandal rushes in to fill the silence. It always does. Accusations don't need evidence. They just need anxiety. Hatshepsut responded in the most threatening way possible. By governing well. Her reign was stable. Trade expanded dramatically. Temples rose. art flourished. No disasters. No collapse. No divine retribution. Which only made things worse for her critics because now they couldn't say, "This is wrong because it fails." They had to say, "This is wrong because it shouldn't exist." Later rulers attempted to erase her memory, not because she was immoral or incompetent, but because she proved something dangerous, that the system could bend and survive. And nothing frightens tradition more than flexibility. Nothing threatens established power more than proof that the rules aren't actually necessary. Hatshepsut wasn't indulgent. She wasn't excessive. She wasn't perverted in any personal sense. Her scandal was structural. She exposed how fragile power narratives really are, and how quickly society will invent moral panic when someone doesn't fit the assigned box. In a long list of pharaohs who abused privilege, Hatshepsut's greatest crime was refusing to stay in her assigned place. Thutmose III is often remembered as Egypt's greatest military commander. Efficient, disciplined, relentlessly successful on the battlefield, which is exactly why his private life feels oddly missing from the record. When a man leaves behind dozens of detailed inscriptions about battles, victories, and divine favor, but almost nothing about personal relationships, historians start squinting at the records and asking what's being deliberately left out. Because silence in ancient history is rarely accidental. Unlike other pharaohs who proudly displayed wives, children, and domestic scenes across temple walls, Thutmose kept his personal life firmly off the public stage. No affectionate release. No celebratory family monuments. No enthusiastic inscriptions about royal fertility or divine unions. Just conquest after conquest after conquest. Now, this could mean Thutmose was deeply private. Entirely possible. It could also mean scribes were instructed to keep certain things carefully off the record. Also entirely possible. Ancient Egyptian records weren't neutral diaries. They were curated propaganda. And what didn't serve the carefully constructed image often disappeared quietly without explanation. Adding to the intrigue is Thutmose's relationship with his stepmother and predecessor, Hatshepsut. After her death, her images were systematically removed. Her names were chiseled away. Her monuments were altered or destroyed. This wasn't a spontaneous tantrum. It was a calculated, organized effort to rewrite memory and erase her from history. And when a ruler is willing to erase someone that thoroughly, historians naturally wonder what else he was willing to erase. Was this about legitimacy? Almost certainly. Was it about resentment? Quite possibly. Was it about controlling the narrative of kingship? Absolutely. Thutmose's reign reinforced a hyper-masculine image of the pharaoh. Warrior. Conqueror. Unstoppable force. Anything that complicated that carefully crafted image, emotional bonds, unconventional relationships, domestic vulnerability, simply didn't make the final cut. If it didn't fit the brand, it vanished. And here's the thing about extreme control over public image. It often signals deep anxiety beneath the surface. When power is genuinely secure, rulers can afford openness and transparency. When it feels threatened or unstable, silence becomes official policy. Thutmose III didn't scandalize Egypt with obvious indulgence. He scandalized historians with deliberate absence. His perversion, if we're using the term loosely, wasn't excess. It was erasure. A reminder that power doesn't just express itself through indulgence and spectacle. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it deletes. Sometimes it leaves behind an image so spotlessly clean it feels artificial. And in ancient history, the cleanest images often hide the messiest truths. Seti I rarely shows up on lists of scandalous rulers, which is exactly why he belongs in this conversation. He represents a quieter kind of excess, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't shock, and never gets caught doing anything awkward on temple walls. Instead, it operates smoothly, politely, and entirely beyond reach for everyone else. Seti ruled with confidence and competence. He restored order after periods of instability. He repaired temples. He presented himself as the calm, responsible adult in the room. And like many calm adults with absolute power, he enjoyed the benefits quietly while maintaining a completely spotless public image. Think less public scandal, more private comfort with zero questions asked. Royal privilege in Seti's time meant access. Access to people. Access to bodies. Access to privacy. Access to silence. The palace was a sealed world where consent was assumed through hierarchy, where "no" was a word reserved for peasants speaking upward but never for kings receiving downward. We don't have explicit records of Seti's private indulgences. And that's precisely the point. Egyptian court culture excelled at discretion. Wives and concubines existed as a structural feature of kingship, not as a moral question. When indulgence is institutionalized into the system itself, it stops generating scandal and starts generating paperwork. Seti's reputation as a good, effective king also worked heavily in his favor. Successful rulers get privacy. They get the benefit of doubt. They get historians saying things like, "There's no evidence of excess," which in ancient terms often translates to, "No one was allowed to write it down." His court set the tone for his son, Ramesses II. A tone that normalized abundance, normalized access, and normalized the idea that a pharaoh's desires were simply part of cosmic order rather than personal choice. Seti didn't invent the system, but he ran it smoothly enough that nobody thought to question it. And that's where the subtle perversion lies. Not in outrageous behavior, not in scandalous rumors, but in a structure where privilege is invisible because it's expected, built in, assumed. Seti didn't need to break rules. The rules were written specifically for him. When power is polite, wrapped in competence and stability, it's much harder to criticize. When indulgence wears a calm smile and a well-maintained temple facade, it blends into history unnoticed, leaving behind a legacy that looks clean, orderly, and deeply, profoundly unequal. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous kind of excess of all. Khufu didn't need scandals to maintain power. He had gravity, the kind that bends everything around it. When you build the Great Pyramid of Giza, people stop asking difficult questions, mostly because they're too busy hauling limestone blocks and reconsidering their entire life choices. Khufu ruled during a time when the pharaoh wasn't just divine. He was completely untouchable. Not metaphorically. Literally. The king was the state incarnate. The god's representative on earth. The owner of basically everything within sight, including your labor, your time, your property, and definitely your opinion. If Khufu wanted something, the universe politely rearranged itself to make that happen. Later Greek writers painted Khufu as cruel, cold, and morally indifferent. They claimed he closed temples, ignored religious customs, and ruled with an iron fist. Now, to be fair, these accounts were written centuries after his death and absolutely drip with Greek cultural bias. But they tell us something important. Khufu's reputation curdled significantly over time. People remembered him not as a benevolent god-king, but as a man who treated humans like building materials. And here's where the perversion enters. Not sexual, but psychological. When absolutely nobody can say no to you, boundaries dissolve completely. Privacy becomes infinite. Desire becomes policy. Personal whim becomes state command. Khufu didn't need to flaunt indulgence because indulgence was completely assumed. The palace was a closed system where hierarchy replaced consent and silence replaced accountability. Did Khufu abuse this power personally? We don't have inscriptions saying, Khufu behaved badly today, because that's not how Egyptian records worked. They recorded what enhanced reputation, not what diminished it. But when a ruler commands tens of thousands of people to work for decades on a tomb meant exclusively for himself, historians raise a significant eyebrow. That level of self-focus isn't neutral. It's revealing. It demonstrates priorities very clearly. Khufu's pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a declaration carved in millions of stone blocks. I matter more than all of you. Forever. And when a society builds that declaration stone by stone, generation by generation, it sends a crystal clear message about whose desires come first. Unlike later pharaohs, who indulged publicly or privately in ways we can track, Khufu embodied a colder form of excess. His perversion wasn't pleasure. It was scale. A system where human lives were abstract units in a massive calculation, and the king's will was the only constant that mattered. Khufu didn't shock Egypt with scandal. He normalized domination so thoroughly that it became invisible. And when domination becomes normal, history stops recording abuse because it stops recognizing it as unusual. If Khufu represents absolute power without feedback, Senusret III represents something even more unsettling. Absolute power with a clipboard and extremely detailed notes. This was a man who didn't just rule Egypt. He managed it. Intensely. Relentlessly. With the emotional warmth of a locked steel door. Senusret was a brilliant military leader and administrator. He fortified borders. He crushed rebellions completely. He reorganized provinces. He weakened local elites so thoroughly that nobody could even think about challenging central authority. Egypt became safer, more centralized, and significantly more anxious. Think extremely well-run state crossed with everyone whispering very carefully indoors. What makes Senusret fascinating isn't indulgence in the traditional sense. It's obsession. He didn't flaunt excess. He eliminated alternatives systematically. Regional governors lost autonomy. Local power networks were dismantled piece by piece. The state became a direct extension of the pharaohs, with no intermediaries. If you were wondering who was in charge, the answer was always identical. Carved in stone. Staring at you with intimidating cheekbones. And those statues matter significantly. Senusret's official portraits show a king with deep-set eyes, heavy lids, and an expression that clearly communicates, "I am profoundly tired of your nonsense, and I haven't even heard it yet." Gone was the youthful idealism of earlier rulers. This was pure authority with bags under its eyes. Here's where the perversion angle quietly enters the picture. Extreme control everywhere creates extreme privacy somewhere. When surveillance tightens across the entire kingdom, the palace becomes the only completely unregulated space. The king who controls everything outside controls everything inside too. Bodies. Schedules. Access. Silence. Nobody records what happens behind closed doors, because everyone understands who owns the doors, the walls, the entire structure. Senusret didn't need a massive harem to signal power. The system itself did that work for him automatically. When hierarchy is absolute and unchallengeable, consent becomes entirely theoretical. The king's desires don't clash with law. They are the law by definition. What's especially telling is that later rulers backed away from his level of centralization. It worked too well. It concentrated too much fear, too much pressure, too much dependence on a single individual. Egypt survived Senusret, but it exhaled deeply afterward. Senusret III wasn't scandalous in the loud, obvious sense. He didn't chase excess publicly. He perfected dominance quietly. And history reminds us that when control becomes total and unchallengeable, indulgence doesn't need to be recorded. Because nobody is left who can question it. If earlier pharaohs made people uncomfortable quietly, Ptolemy II did it formally, publicly, with official paperwork and coins. He didn't just participate in taboo behavior. He legalized it, celebrated it, and then literally put it on currency. Ptolemy ruled Egypt during the Greek Ptolemaic period, which already made things culturally complicated. Greek elites had moved into Egypt, adopted Egyptian kingship traditions, and then immediately discovered they were expected to behave like gods. This included one very specific divine tradition: sibling marriage. So Ptolemy married his sister. Not secretly, not reluctantly, not with any shame whatsoever. Openly, proudly, with full religious ceremony and state approval. He even earned the nickname Philadelphus, which translates to sibling lover, which is the kind of title that sounds much better in ancient Greek than it does spoken out loud in modern conversation. To Egyptians, this wasn't particularly shocking. Pharaohs had married siblings before to preserve divine bloodlines. Gods married gods in mythology. Kings imitated gods in reality. Very neat. Very symmetrical. Very mythological. But to Greek observers, who were definitely not raised on this particular tradition, it was deeply, profoundly unsettling. Greek writers twisted themselves into philosophical knots trying to explain how this could possibly be acceptable behavior. Ptolemy, meanwhile, did not care even slightly. In fact, he leaned into it hard. He and his sister wife were presented as a divine couple modeled directly after sibling gods in mythology. Temples honored them together. Coins displayed their paired images. Inscriptions praised their union. If anyone had objections, they were strongly encouraged to keep them extremely private. This is where power fundamentally reshapes morality. When a ruler is worshipped as divine, taboo doesn't disappear. It flips completely. What would horrify ordinary people becomes sacred when performed by the king. The act doesn't change. The framing does. And once something is framed as holy, criticism becomes heresy. Ptolemy II didn't invent sibling marriage, but he perfected its public branding. He normalized it so thoroughly that future Ptolemaic rulers followed suit automatically, turning what began as tradition into dynastic habit with entirely predictable consequences for health, stability, and long-term reputation. Ptolemy wasn't perverted in the chaotic sense. He was methodical, organized. He shows us something crucial about absolute power. It doesn't just break rules. It relabels them. And once the label changes, society adjusts accordingly. Even if it has to stop making direct eye contact with the family tree. If Ptolemy II shows us how taboo can be normalized through ceremony and state authority, Ptolemy IV shows us what happens when the ruler stops pretending to care about literally anything else besides personal comfort. This was not a man interested in governance, military discipline, or long-term stability. This was a man interested in being comfortable, entertained, and left completely alone to enjoy himself. Ancient sources describe Ptolemy IV as a ruler who outsourced every single boring part of kingship so he could focus exclusively on pleasure. Administration? Delegated. Military matters? Delegated. Public appearances? Only if absolutely necessary, and preferably followed immediately by a banquet. The state essentially ran on institutional inertia, while the king ran on pure indulgence. What makes Ptolemy IV particularly unsettling is how openly this happened. There was no attempt to hide it behind divine symbolism or religious duty. He didn't pretend his excess served the gods or benefited the people. He simply enjoyed the privileges of absolute power and let everyone else deal with the inevitable consequences. The royal court became a playground. Entertainers, favorites, and courtiers competed desperately for influence, not through competence or skill, but through proximity to the king. If you wanted power, you didn't govern well. You pleased the king. And pleasing the king often meant encouraging the very behaviors that were quietly hollowing out the state from within. Ancient historians accuse him of surrounding himself with corrupt advisers and indulging in constant luxury, while Egypt's institutions slowly weakened. Now, as always, we should read hostile sources carefully. But even allowing for significant exaggeration, a clear pattern emerges. When leadership becomes optional, decadence rushes in to fill the vacuum. The deep irony is that Ptolemy IV still ruled a genuinely powerful kingdom. Egypt's accumulated wealth masked dysfunction effectively. As long as grain shipments flowed and rituals continued on schedule, the illusion of stability held. But beneath the surface, neglect spread quietly. The most dangerous kind of decay. This is indulgence not as scandal, but as complete abandonment. A ruler so insulated by inherited power that consequences feel entirely theoretical. Ptolemy IV didn't shock people with outrageous acts. He disappointed them with absence, with not caring. Ptolemy IV wasn't perverted because he crossed clear taboos. He was perverted because he stopped caring entirely. And history is deeply unforgiving to rulers who treat power like a luxury amenity rather than a responsibility. When indulgence replaces responsibility completely, decline doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives slowly, politely, and then all at once. Nero was not an Egyptian pharaoh. He did not wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. He did not build pyramids. He did not pretend to be Horus in human form. And yet, in Egypt specifically, he might as well have been one. Under Roman rule, emperors were worshipped in Egypt as divine figures. This was standard practice. This meant that Nero, a man already famous throughout the empire for excess, ego, and spectacularly questionable decision-making, suddenly found himself receiving religious reverence in a culture that treated rulers as gods by absolute default. This was not a healthy combination. Egyptian temples honored Nero with statues and elaborate inscriptions. Priests performed rituals in his name. Offerings were made. To Egyptians, this was business as usual. Standard operating procedure. To Nero, however, this was validation on an almost dangerous level. He didn't just rule Egypt. He was adored there by divine right in a land that had specialized in ceremonial worship for thousands of years. And Nero absolutely loved ceremony and theatrical displays. Roman sources already describe him as theatrical, self-indulgent, and deeply invested in his own image and public perception. Add Egyptian divinity to that volatile mix, and you get a ruler who felt not just powerful but cosmically justified in everything he did. When a man who craves applause is told the gods themselves demand it, restraint exits the room very quietly. Unlike earlier pharaohs, who were shaped by Egyptian tradition from birth, Nero dropped into this role fully formed with Roman habits completely intact. The result was a genuine collision of cultures. Roman excess wrapped tightly in Egyptian sanctity. The rituals continued. The incense burned. The emperor's ego expanded accordingly. What's especially telling is how differently Egypt remembered Nero compared to Rome. Roman writers absolutely loathed him, despised him. Egyptian records, by contrast, were neutral to moderately positive. Why such a stark difference? Because Egypt had thousands of years of experience surviving rulers who behaved badly behind divine masks. Nero wasn't shocking there. He was familiar, expected even. He represents a strange, revealing turning point. The pharaohship without traditional responsibility. Nero received worship without having to maintain the ancient balance Egyptian kings were expected to uphold. He didn't protect Ma'at or cosmic order. He didn't embody divine justice. He just accepted the benefits freely. Nero's perversion wasn't uniquely Egyptian in origin. It was imported directly from Rome. He shows us what happens when absolute reverence meets absolute ego, completely stripped of the cultural restraints that once kept divine kingship at least somewhat grounded. Egypt didn't change Nero. Nero simply took full advantage of Egypt. And in that sense, he may be the most honest chapter in this entire story. Living proof that when anyone is treated like a god long enough, they start acting like one. Badly. After examining 15 pharaohs, one pattern should feel impossible to ignore. Ancient Egypt didn't produce unusually perverted rulers by some cultural accident. It produced unchecked ones by systematic design. The behavior wasn't random. It wasn't cultural quirk. It was structural, built into the foundation itself. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods walking among mortals. Their bodies were sacred. Their words were literal law. And their desires were consistently framed as cosmical rather than personal choice. In that kind of system, restraint doesn't disappear overnight. It simply never develops in the first place. You don't learn boundaries when absolutely nobody has the authority to set them. What looks like shocking indulgence to us often looked like sacred duty to them. Incest wasn't taboo. It was tradition. Excess wasn't greed. It was divine favor made visible. Absolute control wasn't tyranny. It was stability and cosmic order. When the entire culture reinforces these ideas generation after generation, Behavior that would be condemned elsewhere becomes normalized, even celebrated, sacred. And once something is normalized and declared sacred, it stops being questioned entirely. Some pharaohs leaned heavily into public intimacy, some into material luxury, some into military domination, some into calculated silence. Some did very little at all, trusting the system to run itself while they enjoyed the benefits passively. But all of them shared one crucial thing: no meaningful consequences during their lives. Even the so-called bad pharaohs were rarely punished in any real sense. At worst, their names were erased later, long after they were safely dead and completely beyond accountability. During their actual lives, they moved freely within a palace system designed to protect privacy, ensure obedience, and maintain silence. That's the real discomfort here. Not the specific behaviors themselves, but how easily they survived, how naturally they emerged, how thoroughly they were protected. Egypt endured as a civilization because its institutions were strong enough to outlast individual excess. But those excesses left permanent marks: weakened dynasties, fragile successions, declining central authority, and a very long tradition of pretending nothing was fundamentally wrong as long as the rituals continued on schedule. From Akhenaten's boundary-breaking emotional displays to Ptolemaic sibling marriages, from indulgent courts to rulers who simply checked out completely, history shows us one thing with absolute clarity: power doesn't corrupt in one dramatic moment. It corrodes slowly, politely, quietly, and often with incense burning pleasantly in the background. So when we call these pharaohs perverted, what we're really saying is this: they lived in a world where nothing pushed back, ever. And history's quiet warning is simple and direct. Whenever power becomes sacred and unchallengeable, human behavior stops being negotiable. Not because people become inherently worse, but because nobody is allowed to say no. Nobody has the authority to set limits. And that, more than any specific scandal, is what turns rulers into cautionary legends and systems into warnings that echo across millennia. Thanks for watching tonight's journey through ancient Egypt. If you found this exploration valuable, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment about what you'd like to see next. And remember, the past isn't just history. It's a mirror. What we see there says as much about us as it does about them. Until next time, stay curious,